Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who is not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He created everything except himself, including you and your actions. Nothing occurs except by his will, both good and bad, he destined to happen. He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light, he's not a spirit, he has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled master, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is a slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And may Allah increase us in patience, humility, knowledge, and comprehension, and help us to put our knowledge into practice and grant us all sincere intentions. Ameen. We're continuing in the book, the Hadrami Introduction, Al-Muqaddimah Al-Hadramiyya, by the Allama Ba'fadl, rahimahullah. We're still in the first section of the book, the section that deals with purification. We've made it to page 15. We've made it to page 13, which is the chapter dealing with ghusl. The chapter dealing with ghusl. Page 13, insha'Allah ta'ala. For anyone here who doesn't ordinarily attend this lesson, I'm going to remind you this text is a text in Shafi'i fiqh. Okay? By fiqh, we mean the rules of how to practice this religion as they were derived through the methodology established by one of the big imams. In this case, it's the methodology that was established by Imam al-Shafi'i. I'm just mentioning this because some of you who attend the lesson don't ordinarily follow the Shafi'i school. So you might hear something in the lesson different than what you know or different than what you were taught. Please understand, this doesn't mean that what you were taught is necessarily wrong. It just means that what you were taught is different than what the Shafi'is say. Okay? If you heard something other than what's in this book, well, then I can neither confirm that it's true nor deny that it's true. It's simply not what the Shafi'is teach. Page 13. It says the chapter of the purification wash, ghusl. So you'll notice that in this chapter, he usually translates the word ghusl as wash, which I personally find to be confusing. And most of us here in the US, certainly if you've been Muslim for a little while, you've learned the word ghusl. And we're used in this country, we're used to just saying ghusl. We don't always translate all these Arabic terms. You know, some of them we've just brought the Arabic word into English. And this is a case where I prefer to keep the word ghusl as ghusl. We understand what it means. If there's anyone here who does not understand what the word ghusl means, it refers to a washing of the entire body, meaning all of the skin and all of the hair on the outside of the body. You wash all of it with the intention of lifting major ritual impurity or major hadath. Hadath being a word, an Arabic word that we haven't yet started using in English, but I do want to try to bring that one over so that we really understand hadath and the difference between hadath and najas. Okay. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, said, the actions that necessitate washing ghusl are. So what follows next is a list of things that, if they occur, it's obligatory for a ghusl to be performed afterwards. The first one in the list is a little bit different than the others, so we'll talk about that one first. The first one in the list that he mentions is death. Okay, so if a person died, not just any person, but if the person was a Muslim and he died such that he does not count as a battlefield martyr, then for that person, it is an obligation upon the community, meaning it's a communal obligation upon everyone that's aware of his death to wash his body, among other things that need to be done when a Muslim dies. There's a whole chapter coming up later in the book about funeral rites and what's required. The ghusl is one of the funeral rites that needs to be done. He lists it here as something that necessitates a ghusl, because if a Muslim dies and he's not a battlefield martyr, there is an obligation that a ghusl be performed for him. That's why it's mentioned in the list. But this one is a little bit different from the other things in the list. Why? What's different about this one? It's because if someone dies, the obligation to make ghusl does not fall upon the one who died. It falls upon the living. So those of us who did not die and are aware of his situation, we are the ones that have to make sure he gets a ghusl. He's not obligated to give a ghusl for himself, obviously, because he passed away. Everything else in this list are things where if it happens to you, you are the one that's obligated to perform a ghusl upon yourself, not anyone else, you. Okay, so that's a difference here that matters. And in fact, this difference is so important that you'll find that some books of the Shafi'i school do not even mention death in this chapter. They don't mention it as something that necessitates a ghusl. Why? Because if death happens to you, you don't have to perform a ghusl. You're dead now. You don't have to do anything. Someone else is going to be the one to perform that ghusl. So they don't mention it in this chapter. MashaAllah. Number 2 is menstruation. So the second thing that necessitates a ghusl is menstruation. What is menstruation? Menstruation is blood that comes from the uterus of the woman. Okay, not the vagina, but it comes from deeper in. It comes from the uterus of the woman. It comes out not due to any kind of injury or sickness, and not due to childbirth. Okay, this is blood that comes out even when a woman is healthy, even if she did not just have a baby. This blood comes out, and it comes from the uterus. This blood is not like other blood. It is usually darker than other bloods, and thicker than other bloods, and with a stronger smell than other bloods. But the description of this blood can change. So a woman at the beginning of her period, the blood might look one way, and at the end of her period, it might look a different way. All of that is normal. Okay? But once the menstruation ends, once she stops bleeding, that is when she's now obligated to make a ghusl. Okay, and she's not obligated necessarily to do it at that instant. Like at the moment she realizes she stopped bleeding, she has to make a ghusl right then and there. No. Rather, she needs to make the ghusl before she's able to do the various things that a menstruating woman is not allowed to do. Okay, we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to it. The menstruation cannot last more than 15 days. And we'll get to all of this in a couple of chapters. I don't want to give too much information now, because there's a whole chapter about blood that's coming up in a few pages, inshallah. But know that the obligation to perform a ghusl, it comes upon her only after her menstruation ended. Okay, so once her menstruation is ended, she's now going to be obligated to perform salats. And before she can perform a salat, she's going to have to make a ghusl, for example. Number 3 in the list of things that necessitate ghusl or number 3 is postnatal bleeding. When we say postnatal bleeding, we're referring to blood that comes out of the woman's private part because she emptied her womb. Okay, so this is blood that comes out after a baby is born. Or in some cases, it might not even be a baby yet. Sometimes the woman's womb empties out early, when she might only be 2 or 3 months pregnant. And something might come out of her that doesn't even look like a human yet. But even then, if this thing comes out of her, and because this came out of her, she bleeds afterwards, that bleeding that comes afterwards is called postnatal bleeding or postpartum bleeding. This postpartum bleeding cannot last for more than 60 days. And whenever the postpartum bleeding ends, this is when she's obligated to make a ghusl. Number 4 in the list, giving birth. So the 4th thing that will necessitate a ghusl is for the woman to give birth, meaning the thing that was in her womb came out. Again, whether it was a fully formed baby or whether it was, a miscarriage and the baby came out partially formed, or even if it's just like a little clot of flesh or a clot of blood, giving birth itself necessitates a ghusl. So even if she did not bleed afterwards, okay, even if after this clump of flesh or whatever it was in her womb came out, if she did not bleed afterwards, she still needs to make a ghusl before she can perform salat. Okay, that's because the postnatal bleeding is not the only thing that necessitates ghusl. The childbirth itself necessitates a ghusl. So even if no blood happens afterwards, the childbirth alone is a cause that will put major hadath upon that woman, and the only way to remove major hadath is ghusl. These past 3 things that I just read, menstruation, postnatal bleeding, and giving birth, these things only occur to women. Okay. Actually, for giving birth, I didn't read all of it. It says number 4, giving birth, even if it is an embryo and even if it is without moisture. Okay. Meaning like nothing else came out afterwards. No blood came out afterwards. Even in that case, you have to make a ghusl. Numbers 2, 3, and 4 only happen to women. Those things do not happen to men. Okay, so don't be deceived by these things you see going around the internet where you see someone that looks like a man and you see a blood stain in their pants and they try to tell you that even men can have menstruations. No, okay, don't be deceived by that. That's not really a man. Okay, that's a woman dressed up like a man. Okay, men do not have menstruations. Number 5. Number 5 in the list of things that necessitates a ghusl. It says major ritual impurity, which, I don't like that particular translation because what the actual Arabic text says here is janaba. Janaba. Okay, janaba is a term. It's like a broad term that covers both number 5 and number 6 here in the list. Okay, so there's 2 ways for a person to have janaba. The Arabic word for someone who has janaba is junub. So a person is junub if he has janaba on him. What is janaba? Number 5, janaba. which occurs by the exit of sexual fluid. Okay, so the first way that janaba can happen is if a person releases their sexual fluid. Sexual fluid for a man is called semen. Sexual fluid for a woman, I don't know what it's called, but women also have a fluid that they release if they climax. Okay, this fluid, the Arabic word for this fluid is mani. In Arabic, the word mani is used to refer to the fluid that the man releases, and it also refers to the fluid that the woman releases. It's the same word for both. It's not like English. In English, when we say semen, we're only talking about men. But the Arabic word mani refers to what the woman releases as well as what the man releases. And the point here is that if any of us, man or woman, releases their sexual fluid, like the fluid that comes out when one climaxes, this fluid, the release of this fluid, causes janaba to come on you, and it will necessitate a ghusl, meaning before you will be able to make a salat, you're going to have to do a ghusl. How do you know, let's say some fluid came out from your body, how do you know if that fluid is actually sexual fluid? How do you know if it's semen? How do you know if it's the woman's version of semen? What are the signs? It says, this is known, meaning you'll know if that fluid that came out was sexual fluid or not. This is known by its ejaculation. So the first sign that the fluid that came out of you was semen or women's semen, the first sign is that it comes out in spurts. In spurts. It doesn't just kind of like ooze out. It comes out in like pushes. Like a burst will come out, and then another burst will come out, and then another burst will come out. Okay, that's the first sign that something is mani, like men's semen or women's semen. Okay, so if your fluid came out in spurts like that, this means that the fluid that came out is mani, and that you are now obligated to make a ghusl. It then says, or. What does this word or mean? It means that the three signs that it's going to mention here is not the case that all three of them have to happen. It doesn't say ejaculation and something else and some third thing. No, it says ejaculation or a second thing or a third thing. So what that means is even if just one of these three signs is true, that is already sufficient as evidence that the fluid in question is in fact mani, and that you do in fact have janaba, and that you are in fact obligated to make a ghusl. The first sign is ejaculation, meaning it comes out in bursts. The second sign, it says, experienced in brackets, pleasure on its exit. So the second sign that something is mani is that the exit of this mani will be accompanied by pleasure. Okay, you will feel a pleasurable sensation when this thing is released. So again, if you release a fluid and you experience pleasure when it's released, that means that the fluid is mani, even if it did not come out in spurts, even if it did not come out with a burst here and a burst there. If the pleasure was present, then that is sufficient evidence for you to conclude that that was mani that came out, which means you have janaba on you, which means you're obligated to make a ghusl. What's the third and final sign that you would know that something is mani? And the translation here is incorrect, so please pay attention. It says in the book, or the smell of moist dough, or smell of dried white of an egg. That's what he wrote here, but he has the moist and the dry referring to the wrong thing. The third sign of mani is that when the semen, when the fluid that came out of you is moist, it will smell like dough. And when the mani is dry, it smells like egg whites. We're not saying it smells like dried egg whites. We're saying if the mani is dry, it will smell like an egg white that's not dry. It'll smell like if you crack open an egg and see what an egg white smells like, that's what dried semen smells like. And if you make some dough, you get the flour and water and salt or whatever else they mix together to make the dough. If you roll that all into dough and see what dough smells like, well, that's what semen smells like when it's moist, before it dries. So semen, when it's moist, smells like dough. When semen is dry, it smells like egg whites. The smell is the third sign that something is mani. So if a fluid came out from your body, even if it did not come out in spurts, even if you did not feel pleasure when it came out, if it smells like dough while this fluid is wet, then that means it's semen, it's mani. And if it dried up and it smells like egg whites now that it's been dried up, then that is evidence that this fluid that came out is mani, it's semen. And therefore you must conclude that you have janaba on you, and you must conclude that you're obligated to make a ghusl. These signs are very important because people discover these things all the time. Okay, it's not unusual for somebody to wake up in the morning and find that there's a wet spot in their underwear, or even a dried up spot in their underwear. Maybe it's not wet anymore. And they need to think back, did I experience some kind of pleasure, or did something come out in spurts? And maybe they don't remember those things. So what do, they smell it to determine if this thing that's in the underwear, is this something that means I have to make a ghusl? Or is this something that just means I need to do istinja and make wudu? Okay, we need to know these signs so we can identify what is this thing that came out. And I want to emphasize here, I want to really stress, color is not a reliable sign. Color is not a reliable sign. Some people will think, well, if it's white, it's semen. And since it's not white, that means it's not semen. This is not true. Okay, semen is not always white. Okay, semen can change colors. Furthermore, the semen of a woman, the mani of a woman, is not necessarily the same color that the mani of a man is. So the color is not a reliable sign. There's 3 signs for you to rely upon. Whether it came out in spurts, whether it came out with pleasure, and the smell. Any one of these signs is enough evidence for you to conclude that what came out is mani. All of this that we just mentioned, all of so far in number 5, this is the first way for a person to have janaba. That is, if mani comes out of the body. Notice that for number 5, it doesn't say anything about having sex. Just the fact that mani came out of the body is enough for you to have janaba and now be obligated to make a ghusl. Okay, and mani might come out of the body even if one does not have sex. For example, a person might be asleep and have a dream, and mani might come out. The fact that mani came out is what obligates the ghusl, even if sexual intercourse did not take place. Now, number 6 says it also occurs. So this is the second way that janaba can come upon you. And this number 6 basically means by sexual intercourse. Okay, so there's 2 ways for janaba to come upon you. One is by mani coming out of your body, like your own mani coming out of your body. And the second type is for one to have sexual intercourse. What we're going to read now is the definition of sexual intercourse, so that you will understand at what point did intercourse actually take place, and at what point, so you'll know that before that point, it wasn't intercourse yet. It says, it also occurs by the penetration of the head of the male organ. Okay? Or its equal in a private opening. What does that mean? It means that in order for an act to count as sexual intercourse, it must be the case that the head of the man's penis entered into the woman's vagina. Once the head of the penis disappears inside the woman, it is at that moment that actual intercourse has taken place. So if the tip of the penis goes in, but the entire head has not gone in, sex did not take place yet. Okay, if only the tip went in and the whole head didn't go in, you don't have janaba yet, and you're not obligated to make a ghusl yet. At that point, it is not yet sex. You should also understand from this that many of the other things that people call sex these days doesn't count as sexual intercourse Islamically. Okay, what people nowadays call oral sex, it doesn't meet the definition, because the head of the penis is not going into the vagina. Okay? I just want you to understand where the lines are. Okay? The ghusl becomes obligatory if mani came out or if sexual intercourse happened. All right? If it wasn't one of those two things, then you don't have to make a ghusl. But let's read what remains. It says, the head of the male organ or its equal. What does or its equal mean? It means that if, let's say, there's a man who, for one reason or another, had part of his organ cut off. Somebody cut off part of his organ, and therefore the head of the penis is gone. It's not there anymore because it was cut off. In this case, what we do is we estimate. We say if what remains of the penis went into the vagina, right? The part that remains of the penis, if the equivalent of the head of the penis went into the vagina, then that's the moment when sex occurred. Okay, it's only sexual intercourse once the head of the penis enters the vagina or the equivalent of the head of the penis enters the vagina. Equivalent meaning an equivalent amount of actual penis. I don't mean equivalent like if someone put something that's not a penis in there. No, that's not what we mean by the equal of the head of the penis or the equivalent of the head. We mean actual penis, but the head isn't there. So once an amount of the shaft enters, which is equal to what the head of the penis would have been, at that moment is when intercourse took place. Even if they stopped, even if he went in that far and then decided not to do anymore, he pulled out and stopped. Even though no mani was released, even though no semen was released, he would still be obligated to make a ghusl. Why? Because sexual intercourse took place. Okay, I want us to in our minds, keep separate the issue of sex and the issue of the release of one's sexual fluid. We're not saying both of them have to happen in order for a ghusl to be required. One or the other is enough. Let me read this sentence again. It says, by the penetration of the head of the male organ or its equal in a private opening. When it says a private opening, the author, may Allah have mercy on him, used a vague word on purpose. On purpose, he did this. So according to the Sharia, sexual intercourse is the insertion of the head of the penis into what? Into the vagina. That's the only thing that counts as sexual intercourse. Penis into vagina. However, there's something called qiyas, where something is treated as if it's something else. And so the ruling in the Shafi'i school is that if the head of the penis goes into the anus, even though this technically is not sexual intercourse, it's treated as if it's sexual intercourse. So the rules of sexual intercourse will apply to it. Okay, so the author, mashallah, he knows that if the head of the penis went into the anus, this also would be treated like sexual intercourse. It means this person also has janaba on him. It means this person also is obligated to make a ghusl. That's why here he didn't say vagina. He just said a private opening. He wanted to use a term vague enough that it would include the vagina and also include the anus. That's why it says to include the back passage. Okay, now my preference would have been to translate it as even if it's the back passage. Okay, so he's saying if the head of the penis enters into a private opening, meaning a vagina, even if it's the back passage, meaning also if it's the anus, this will count as janaba, and this will require one to make a ghusl. Then he says, even that of a dead person or animal. So even if this vagina or this anus belonged to someone who was dead, or even if this vagina or anus belonged to an animal, and I'm not saying that these actions are permissible because they're not. Rather, I'm saying that if these actions were to happen, what would the ruling be? The ruling would be that that person has janaba and is obligated to make a ghusl before he can make a salat. All right, the rules that we study in the Islamic law, they cover things that are permissible and they cover things that are not permissible. Okay, because we need to know what to do when these situations come up. And it's not the case that everyone is always obedient. Sometimes people do haram things. And when those situations come up, we still need to know, what does the Sharia say about how we should behave? How should we act in that situation? Okay, so some of the things that are mentioned here are things that are haram. Okay, intercourse in the anus is haram, even if it's with your own wife. It's haram. Okay, but if you were to do it, what would the ruling be? That it's treated as if that were sexual intercourse and you have to make a ghusl. If you were to do it with a dead person or an animal, it's haram, but you would have to make a ghusl. And by the way, when I say this, I don't just mean, I'm not only talking to the men. You know, if a woman had sex with an animal, like if the, you know, she would still need to make a ghusl afterwards. It says, and even if it is with a heavy barrier. It says, and even if it is with a heavy barrier. Okay, so some people, they think, for example, that if they wear a condom, then it won't count as sex and they won't have to make a ghusl afterwards. No, that's nonsense. Okay, if the head of the penis entered into the vagina, sexual intercourse took place, and you're going to have to make a ghusl afterwards. The fact that there's a barrier between the man and the woman does not mean it's not sexual intercourse. Okay, even if that barrier were very thick, still it would count as sexual intercourse and the person would need to make a ghusl. He says it also occurs by seeing sexual fluid on one's clothes. What that means is if you see a stain in your clothes and you determine that that stain is due to sexual fluid, and see, it's not written here, but this is another important condition, and no one else has worn those clothes. well, then in that case, you need to conclude that that sexual fluid came from you, and therefore you are the one that has to make ghusl. So if you see sexual fluid in clothing that only you have worn, then that means you need to make a ghusl. It says, or in a bed where no one sleeps besides that person. So if you see in your sheets a stain from sexual fluid, and you know no one else sleeps in that bed but you, well, then you need to conclude, therefore, that it came from you. And so you need to make a ghusl. MashaAllah. Are there any questions here? If you have questions, put them in the box. I apologize if this topic is making everyone uncomfortable. I assure you it's making me uncomfortable as well. I don't like talking about these things in such in such a vivid way. But I find that it's necessary for you to understand what the law actually is. Okay, the key to understanding fiqh is knowing the definitions of things so that you know what a term applies to and what it does not apply to. So that you know what the ruling is in this situation and you don't apply it to a different situation. So clarity is of utmost importance, even if it sometimes means that I use words I would not ordinarily use. Please understand I'm doing it out of a necessity in this case. And I'm not shy about this. Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he praised the women of the Ansar. The Ansar, as I'm sure you know, are the Muslims of Medina who welcomed the immigrants when the immigrants migrated to Medina and helped them and supported our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These people are known as the Ansar. And the women among the Ansar, our Prophet alaihi salatu wasallam praised them. He said, because they do not let their shyness prevent them from seeking knowledge. Okay, he said that because it was the women of the Ansar who would ask questions about menstruation and bleeding and things that the other women were too shy to ask about. They were the ones who asked the questions so that we would gain the knowledge and we would know what to do. Our Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam praised them for not letting their shyness be a barrier towards getting this knowledge. This is why, even though it makes me uncomfortable, I will still do it because the clarity is what's required. Okay, and as someone put in the box, we're adults here. I think all of us can handle this, even if it's a little bit strange. Besides, in our times, we've probably all heard far worse than this. MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum. Let's finish. It says, with major ritual impurity. And again, what this translator means when he says major ritual impurity, what he means here is janaba. Okay, I don't like him saying major ritual impurity because major ritual impurity covers janaba and covers other things as well. It's too broad of a translation. So what he's really saying is with janaba. And what's janaba again? Janaba occurs in two ways. Janaba occurs either by a person releasing their sexual fluid or by a person having sexual intercourse or something that's treated like sexual intercourse. Okay, these are the two ways that janaba happens. If a person has janaba, what does it say here? It is prohibited to do the acts prohibited with minor ritual impurity. So we already read a couple chapters ago. What are the things that are haram to do if you break your wudu? Okay, if you have minor hadath, what are the things that are haram? For example, it's haram to make salat. It's haram to make tawaf around the Kaaba. It's haram for you to touch the mushaf or carry the mushaf, right? We talked about those things. Those things are forbidden if you have minor hadath. So what happens if you have janaba, which is a type of major hadath? Well, then those things are prohibited, but also additional things are prohibited. So you can't make salat, you can't make tawaf, you can't touch the mushaf, you can't carry the mushaf. Okay, according to the details we mentioned in that chapter. And on top of that, it says, in addition to remaining in the masjid. So a person who has janaba is allowed to enter into a masjid, but they can't stay inside. Okay, they'd only be allowed to enter a masjid if they're just going straight through. Because in like Islamic towns and things, the masjid is often in the center of the town or near the center of the town with entrances on all sides. And sometimes the quickest way for a person to get where he's going is to go in the masjid and just walk straight through and go out the door that's on the other side. Okay, if a person has janaba, this is permissible. Okay, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, Illa abiri sabil. Okay, he says that specifically, says the one who's just passing through, they can do that when they have janaba. Okay, they can do that. But what they cannot do is hang out. They can't just stop in the masjid and stand still for 3 seconds. Okay, that's hanging out. They can't stay there and have a conversation. That's hanging out. They can't lay down and take a nap. That's hanging out. Okay, you can't remain in the masjid. If you have janaba, you're allowed to enter it, but only if you're going to walk straight through it and out the other side. It says, and coming/going without an excuse. That's what it means. That's what remaining means. Like for you to walk into the masjid and just kind of walk back and forth inside there, go in here to this corner, go to that corner, go talk to that person, pace back and forth. All of this counts as remaining in the masjid, even if you didn't sit down or lay down. Okay. The fact of the matter is you didn't enter and then go immediately out the other side. That's forbidden if you're in a state of janaba. It also mentions, it says, and recitation of Quran with the intention of recitation. So if you have minor hadath, if you broke wudu, it's haram for you to touch the mushaf or carry the mushaf, but it's not haram for you to recite Quran. You can recite as much Quran as you want if you broke wudu, as long as you're not touching the mushaf or carrying it. But if a person has janaba, meaning their mani came out, their semen came out, or meaning that they had sex, if a person has janaba, then it's haram for them to recite the Quran with their tongue. Okay, so it's not merely touching the mushaf and carrying it, which is forbidden. Reciting the Quran is forbidden for the one who has janaba, as long as, what does it say here? As long as it's with the intention of recitation. Okay, so it's not haram for you to say something that just so happens to match an ayah of the Quran. Like if somebody gave you some good news, they said, "Hey man, I finally got a job," and you turn around and you say Alhamdulillah, or you say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, but it's not your intention to say an ayah from the Fatiha. Right? You weren't thinking, "Oh, let me recite this ayah of Quran." You were just saying Alhamdulillah. You were just making a dhikr. Okay, if you're saying a dhikr, it's not your intention to recite the Quran. This is permissible if you have janaba, because even though that particular dhikr is found in the Quran, it wasn't your intention to recite the Quran. It was your intention to recite what? A dhikr. Okay. Similarly, if you're saying something just for purposes of wow, you just want to like say something to somebody to benefit them religiously. Like you might want to say something to frighten them into obedience. You might say to someone, وَاتَّقُوا النَّارِ. Say to them, fear the fire. Because you're saying to them something which will benefit them. You want to say words that affect their heart, hit them with some emotion that will push them to be better Muslims. And maybe the thing you say, وَاتَّقُوا النَّارِ, which means fear the fire, that expression, it's found in the Quran. That sequence of words is found in the Quran. But when you said it, it wasn't your intention to say the Quran. It was your intention to say something that's going to frighten this person and scare him straight. Okay, if that's why you said something that's in the Quran, this is permissible even if you have janaba. Why? Because it wasn't your intention to recite Quran. It was your intention just to preach to this person. Or if it's your intention just to give a ruling. Just to give a ruling. For example, if somebody had janaba, okay, and while they're in the state of janaba, they get a phone call. Okay, and the person that calls them asks them whether you need to, or they ask for some clarification about how to recite the Fatiha in the Salat. And being a very good Shafi'i, you say to the person that you must recite the Fatiha from beginning to end. And you mentioned that Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim is one of the ayahs. Okay, so in this case, you said Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which is found in the Quran. Furthermore, it's found in the Quran. But when you said this to the person, you weren't saying it with an intention of reciting Quran. You were saying it with the intention of clarifying the religious ruling. You were giving a Sharia ruling, a ruling of the madhab, that you must say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim in every rak'ah. In this case, it's not haram for you to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim because it was your intention simply to give the religious ruling. It was not your intention to recite the ayah. Okay. The person who has janaba, it's haram for them to recite the Quran if their intention is to recite ayahs of the Quran. Inshallah, that's clear. And this paragraph here, it did not go on to mention the things that are forbidden for the woman who is menstruating or postpartum bleeding or gave birth to a child. He didn't mention those here, even though at the start of the chapter, he did mention that those are things that obligate a ghusl. He doesn't mention here what's forbidden for those people because it's going to come up later. In a couple of chapters when we start talking about blood and the rules pertaining to blood, at that time he will say that the woman who is menstruating or postpartum bleeding, she is forbidden from doing all of these things that are here, that the one who has janaba is forbidden from doing. But she has additional things that she's forbidden from doing as well, such as fasting, such as entering a masjid, and such as allowing her husband to enjoy what's between her navel and her knee. MashaAllah. I think I'm going to stop here. We'll pick up with the rules of how to actually make a ghusl. Our next class, inshallah, we'll talk about the obligatory parts, some of the sunnahs of ghusl, and some of the disliked matters of ghusl. But if you have a question, please put it in the box, and I will answer it, inshallah ta'ala, if I'm able. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh to all of those who salam to me. Yeah, so one brother asked, if there's no ejaculation during oral sex, then there is no ghusl. That is correct. So if a person, touched his wife in that way and no ejaculation took place, then in that case, they broke their wudus because they touched skin to skin. And if anything came out of the person, if anything came out of, the partner, like say the man or the woman, whoever one is receiving the act, if fluids came out, that's not ejaculation. Okay, it's not like sexual fluid, but it's what they call pre-seminal fluid. What they call in Arabic madhi, which is like a fluid that comes out when a person gets sexually excited, but it comes out before the mani, before the actual climax fluid comes out. There's a fluid that sometimes comes out beforehand that people, y'all know what people refer to it as. If that fluid comes out, then that fluid is simply najis filth. Okay, so the man would need to wash his member to clear himself of that fluid. He makes istinja and he makes wudu. He does not need to make a ghusl. Someone asked, if the full head of the male's organ doesn't penetrate, there's no need for ghusl. But isn't that still considered fornication? The answer is no. If the man put part of the head inside of the woman, but not the full head, then sexual intercourse did not take place. So it cannot be like proper zina, like the zina, which means unlawful sexual intercourse, because there was no sexual intercourse. Okay, this doesn't mean it's permissible though. Okay, it's obviously, unless those people were married or unless the woman was the property of the man, then that would be forbidden. But it would not get the punishment of stoning, nor would it get the punishment of 100 lashes and a year of exile. The punishments that come with zina of sexual intercourse, those types of punishments could not be applied because sexual intercourse didn't take place. Someone asked about people just talking about the Quran. No, it's not the case that wudu is required to talk about the Quran. Remember, if a person has broken wudu, it's not permissible for them to touch the book that has the Quran in it, the mushaf. They can't touch the mushaf and they can't carry the mushaf. But a person who simply broke wudu, they can recite as much Quran as they want. They can sit and recite Quran beginning to end if they want to. Who's the one who's forbidden from reciting Quran? The one who has janaba, the one who had sexual intercourse or released their sexual fluid. That person is not allowed to recite the Quran. Okay, so yes, if a person's going to be online talking about the Quran and reciting a bunch of ayahs and things, he needs to make sure that, if he did something to cause janaba to come on him, he needs to make sure he makes a ghusl before he goes online and talks about those things. Okay, because you can't recite the ayahs of Quran while you are junub, while you are in a state of janaba. That's it. Excellent. Alhamdulillah. Well, if that's everything, then let's say La ilaha illallah La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Someone asks, if a sheikh studied in Saudi Arabia only, does that mean he's a so-called Salafi? No, that in and of itself is not proof that he's a Salafi, but it is very likely that he's a Salafi. It's very likely that he's a Wahhabi. You know, I don't even like to say the word Salafi about them because that word, you know, it's a lie. Like, they're not actually Salafis at all, even if they call themselves that. But no, there are people who go to Saudi Arabia and they study with the Haba'ib that are there. You know, they learn Ash'ari creed and they learn Shafi'i fiqh and they learn, you know, the Sufi path. And they practice it there. Now you need to be very careful doing it there so that the religious police don't catch you. But it is possible for someone to go to Saudi Arabia and not be a Wahhabi. It is possible. But it's unlikely because the official schools they have there, like the al-Qura school in Mecca or the so-called Islamic University in Medina, like the religious schools that they have in Riyadh and all these places, those official schools, all of them teach Wahhabi stuff. So he's very likely to come out of there a Wahhabi. But even then, it's not a guarantee. You know, I'm sure there are people who were not Wahhabis. They went to that school for whatever reason, and they maintained the belief that they had before they went there. And maybe they graduated and they're still not Wahhabis. Like, all kinds of things are possible. Okay, you want to judge a person based on what you hear from that person. Okay, instead of just assuming things about someone, you want to judge them based on what they've said. But if I met someone and what they said was that they studied at the so-called Islamic University of Medina and that they studied there for 4 years and graduated, I would not feel comfortable asking that person to teach my children or to teach anyone's children, just because the likelihood of them being a Wahhabi is way too high. Okay, well, I don't know which person y'all are referring to, but yes, if someone mentions that the people he considers sheikhs are Bin Baz and Uthaymeen and Al-Albani and Ibn Taymiyyah, then for sure this person is a Wahhabi. There's no doubt about it. All right. Anything else before we head out? Yeah, all those names right there are pretty conclusive. Ibn Taymiyyah, I guess there might be some wiggle room about, because sometimes people who are legitimate, are like legit scholars, might mention Ibn Taymiyyah sometimes. But everyone else in that list, no one from Ahl Sunnah gives those people any regard at all. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. I'll see you insha'Allah ta'ala next week at the normal time. Until then, may Allah bless you and make your affairs easy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.